Hello, everyone. Welcome to Radio Sofia. Radio Sofia is an independent virtual platform run by a group of doctoral students at IIM Calcutta to discuss socio-economic and political issues. Today's session is a much awaited session for many economic students like me and many others that I can see in the audience. We have with us Professor Alex M. Thomas from Azim Premji University, Bengaluru, for a conversation on the topic Macroeconomics, a Critical Pedagogy. This conversation is based on his latest book, Macroeconomics and Introduction, which has been just published by Cambridge University Press. And the announcement of this book actually got everybody excited in the economics area, because Alex is surely one of the budding contemporary scholars who is actively engaged in reviving economic thinking in India. And we have known that he actively reads and writes about political economy or history of economic thought. So it was very interesting to see how he brings in the ideas from there and how he integrates it into a textbook like macroeconomics. And in that way, I think the book has been a very, very engaging reading, and I got a copy for myself too. So thank you for this book, Alex. And just to give a little bit of introduction about Alex before we proceed, and he has studied economics at the universities of Madras, Hyderabad, and Sydney. And his main research is in the history of economic thought, and it has been published in various national and international journals, including the Economic and Political Weekly, European Journal of the History of Economic Thought, History of Economic Ideas, and Journal of Interdisciplinary Economics. He has co-edited, published a book on pluralist economics also in 2019. So this talk is going to be in the form of a conversation. So initially, to kickstart the conversation, we have a set of questions for Alex, which he would answer, and after that, we'll open the floor for discussion with the audience. So Alex, firstly, thank you for joining us and accepting this invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kanti and Himadri, for having me here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you. So the first question that we have for you is that in your book, you emphasize it is important to have reasonable knowledge of history, culture, and politics for better understanding of an economy. You also highlight the embeddedness of an economy within the society and natural environment. So why do you think is it necessary to incorporate the non-economic aspects into economic thinking?
Yeah, so let me try to respond to it by giving you, three kinds of scenarios. One is when we think in terms of theory, economics is a lens to understand our surroundings, and economics just provides us with one way of looking at it. And when we theorize or when we study economics, we assume ceteris paribus. So basically, what we are assuming is other things remaining the same. And what we really need to remember and constantly keep in mind is the social embeddedness and the ecological embeddedness. And these are two things that I provide in the second chapter. So that's one part of the theory bit. Because economists are always involved in policy, and more so than other social sciences, it is clear that when it comes to the policy domain or the actual world, the ceteris paribus assumption does not hold. It just simply does not hold. So if we don't recognize the embeddedness, and if we don't recognize that there could be consequences, then it can lead to unintended consequences of a negative nature. So one is a kind of responsibility that social science like economics have because of their role in policy and in theory as well. And the third point is the distinction that is often made in microeconomics between what is questioned and what ought to be questions. So generally it is said that microeconomics is a study of what is, and positive economics, and what ought to be questioned is a normative question, and we are not at the moment interested in that. But economics, and this is what classical political economists understood this. We cannot neatly separate the question of what is and what ought to be, because after all, yesterday, what people thought ought to be the case is what we have today. So in other words, what is a consequence of what ought to be yesterday. And there are ethical positions we need to also understand, certain aspects of philosophy. For instance, because economics tries to, have something like a scientific method, whether borrowing from physics or some other school, we need to also understand the nature of scientific method. So some understanding of philosophy becomes important. And because we use so much of statistics, so much of mathematics, how do we understand causation? There are so many ways to understand causation. What does mathematics mean? I mean, there are, can we apply, and how much can we apply mathematics to a social understanding? And finally, in all this, I go back to the point of the role of policy, because as what is the role of experts, and how much can economics really say, and what is the role for, people who are involved in policy making who might not be economists? So I think if we want to have better engagement and conversation with other social scientists and other people who are trying to understand our surroundings, it's also important to recognize how embedded economics is as a discipline and have better conversations with other disciplines and other people.
Sure, yeah, that's I think very true. So and actually, like you said, okay, let me move on to the second question, which is basically when we look at the evolution of the discipline of economics, as you rightly pointed out, the fundamental unit of analysis has also shifted from class to individuals after the marginalist revolution, right? So can you explain what were some of the consequences of a shift to economic thinking? I think it sort of supplements what you were trying to argue in the first question also. So yeah.
Yeah, so usually I think because of the way economics is taught to us, we often begin with micro, and then we go to macro. And macro is often understood as a simple summation of micro. I mean, that's the way it's generally. And then there have also been attempts to micro find macro, or micro foundations of macroeconomics. But here, I mean, for students, or for all of us, what we need to remember is there are different kinds of microeconomics. There are different kinds of macroeconomics, but we are only taught one kind. So that's one point. And what methodological individualism provides us with is a particular kind of price theory, or a particular kind of value theory, which is based on utility, or more specifically on marginal utility. And the sort of consequence of this is everything becomes a maximization or a minimization problem subject to certain constraints. So what it tells us is that what is the toolbox of economists? It's primarily some kind of constraint optimization. So that's the kind of toolbox. Now the implication of this is we try to understand how governments function, how maybe a family functions, how the agriculture sector functions, based on this methodological individualism, or how an individual is trying to maximize utility. And therefore, people then think that what is good for an individual should be good for, the agriculture sector, should be good for the economy as a whole, should be good for the government. And so this kind of an individual rationality that is found in methodological individualism, which is a particular kind of rationality, has been imposed on understanding families, like Gary Becker did, has been imposed to understand governments, like the public choice theory. And so this has happened. And an extreme version of this, which Keynes pointed out when he spoke about the paradox of thrift, is that for an individual, it might be good to live within their means and save. But then this has been taken to an extreme in the case of austerity, and how a certain kind of economic theory and idea have been imposed so that governments have to be austere. Uh, what the problem with methodological individualism? I'm not saying that some kind of maybe questions may be better answered by that, but certainly it does not answer well the theory of value, or the theory of price, or the theory of distribution, or the theory of output, or the theory of growth. And fundamentally it is unable to recognize structural power. It is unable to recognize that institutions are different. Institutions have certain power relations. Individuals or groups have certain power dynamics. It's not able to incorporate them in a structural manner. And when this logic of the individual gets applied, what really happens is it's a asocial, apolitical, ahistorical kind of uh, rational homo economicus kind of understanding that is being applied. A simple, I mean, sort of counterpoint to this would be, what, because microeconomics or in that assumption that is made in methodological individualism is independent preferences and autonomous preferences. What it means is that suppose I participate in the economic process or whatever activity I participate in, my preferences remain unchanged. In other words, it is incapable of actually accounting for learning. Because as we all know, when we deal with people, when we have certain experiences, we know that our preferences change, what we feel about it change, our rankings change. So in a way, it is incapable of accounting for sociality, historicity, political aspects, structural power, and fundamentally just individual human learning. So I think that because of all this, it the consequences are dire, also for how individuals behave, and maybe also for how governments are expected to behave. And that's why I point out some of the faults with it and say that methodological individualism is a better approach to take. And this has been there in classical political economy before the advent, the dominance of marginalist revolution.
Alex, so while we are discussing about this kind of a difference, so I know that most of us start reading microeconomics with Paul Samuelson textbook or something, and where we are talking about the definition of economics, and it is mostly related to the scarcity of resources, the constraint optimization that you're talking about. That's how it is. And in your book, you clearly say discuss about the science. This definition as economics, a science of choice, and then you differ from that definition and you say your book adopts the definition of economics as science of wealth. So what is the difference between these approaches and how does it alter our existing thinking about economics discipline?
So the current, again, I mean, I think it goes back to science of choice because it goes back to constraint optimization. So the science of choice is in a way, its scope is infinite. You can think of trees having some kind of a choice. You can think of frogs having some kind of a choice. You can think of many other beings in the animal kingdom as having some kind of a choice. And this constraint optimization model has been used in multiple contexts. So by definition, the scope itself is large. And we know that now economists study, identities, economists study religion, economists study caste, economists study political issues. So literally everything can be studied using this rational choice kind of approach. Whereas the scope of the political economists, which is the science of wealth or science of income, they were trying to understand, how can we improve the well-being, economic well-being, right, fundamentally of people and of communities and of nations. So there, the science of wealth definition, what it does is it restricts your attention. Right? It tells us that this is the scope of your study. Your scope is much more limited because you cannot really theorize about many other things. There are some things you can talk about much more definitively, but many other things you have to converse with sociologists, anthropologists, historians, and other people ecologists who are working in these areas. So whereas the science of choice in a way gives economists the intellectual kind of power or to deal with any kind of problem. So that's about demarcating what we should be studying. The second is the kind of focus. The science of choice, which draws from Lionel Robbins, a little bit of Marshall, a little bit of Samuelson, focuses on allocation. it's all about allocation of scarce resources. And this is tied to constraint optimization in some way. The fundamental question is about allocation, whereas the science of income or the science of wealth definition prioritizes and puts its focus on production. Allocation is also a part of it, but the primary site is to understand how production takes place and what are the conditions in which production takes place. The third is to talk about a little bit about the nature, because the definition is not just a simple thing, it has an impact on many other things. How we perceive the subject, what kind of questions are studied, what kind of data is collected, what kind of policy recommendations can be given. Right? And maybe I'll pose a question. There have been people who are working on the question of gender for a long time in gender studies. But today, then, we also have economists who are working on this question. When it comes to policy making, how do we incorporate scholars who have been working in gender studies department versus how do we evaluate, or how do we put them on the same pedestal? Do we take both their ideas into consideration? So this tells us something about how economists also wield a certain kind of power. So the nature of the science of wealth definition is about political economy. Fundamentally, that positive and normative questions are intertwined. And so the question of ethics, etc., becomes important. Whereas marginalist economics, all the kind of reasoning is at the margin. So you have marginal utility, marginal cost, marginal revenue, marginal rate of technical substitution, etc., etc. All of them, all the reasoning is happening at the margin. So what is the role of ethics? What is the role of wider human relations in this? It's not clear. Even if it is brought in, again, you have to impose some kind of constraint optimization there too. And what this really reduces to is what Jevons tried to do in the 1870s, when in the beginning of the marginalist revolution, which is tried to, from a utilitarian principle or a philosophy, try to say that human emotions can be reduced to pain and pleasure. And then your aim is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So a calculus of, or pain and pleasure calculus. Right? So still the science of choice has those bearings and it can be rooted to that. And the last point, the science of wealth definition in a way takes cognizance of the conditions of production, and therefore it is more amenable to what Keynes would call a monetary production economy. So your object of analysis, and as I mentioned in my book, is a monetary production economy. Whereas for the marginalist economists, for the mainstream economists, they make a distinction between the real economy and the monetary economy. Right? And this is also, I think, partly because of their focus on the science of choice. They haven't really engaged with production except from a constrained optimization kind of narrow lens.
Correct. Alex, now that we're getting a little bit technical, so I would next take you to this one of the interesting concepts in economic subject itself, which is about the equilibrium. So we always begin, even in the supply demand itself begins with reaching and talking about equilibrium and the notion of equilibrium. And in your book, you mentioned there are two approaches for this. So one is a narrow approach focusing on partial equilibrium, where one market attains equilibrium under the ceteris paribus conditions, like you just said, and two, general equilibrium, where all markets or sectors attain equilibrium. And then you claim in the book that you adopt a holistic approach, wherein the importance of studying other relevant markets or sectors, and not all markets, is incorporated, but the focus on all around equilibrium is discarded. And how do you do that, and why?
Yeah. Okay. So one is what I've tried to do. So one is that you have the partial equilibrium approach, which is generally what is taught in microeconomics or in economics. Marshallian kind of microeconomics. If you have a Walrasian kind of microeconomics, you take general equilibrium into account. But one of the ways in which equilibrium is characterized here is that it's market clearing. So, so for instance, the labor market is always clear, or other kinds of markets always clear. So I wanted to take the spirit in which this general equilibrium is put forth, which is we don't want to be in a situation where we are only studying, let's say, the agricultural sector, but we don't know the interlinkages between agriculture and manufacturing, or we don't know the consequence of agriculture production on the ecology, or we don't know the link between, let's say, employment and the agriculture sector. So in a way, what I mean by a holistic approach is just to say that I want to think of the macroeconomy as a system where there are many aspects to it. It's not possible to cover the impacts of everything in the macroeconomic system, but I want to alert you to the fact that we need to be considerate, and we need to consider those points when we talk about, especially when we are talking about policy issues. And in theory, we might be forced to bring in some kind of assumptions to arrive at an equilibrium. But when we are trying to study a phenomena, it is possible to talk about it even without any kind of an equilibrium thing, because after all, what is important is to recognize that there are sectors within the economy which are interconnected and interrelated, and there are consequences if we do something in this sector. And what I think macroeconomics really does not give us that, the way in which it's conventionally taught, I feel. For instance, and this is a question that I engage with a little bit in my book, when central bank sets the interest rate, is there an impact on ecological issues? So what is the connection? I'm just going to state the question here, but I'm not going to expand it because I've done that. In my book, I try to say that, we can study the economy in three broad ways. One is a macro approach where we look at aggregates. One is a micro approach where we look at individuals. And you also have an in-between or a meso approach where we are looking at sectors. So this sectoral analysis have happened. Sometimes they're called structural economic dynamics or structuralist macroeconomics. But what it means is that we want to know, if we take a macro kind of a question like inflation or employment, is there any impact on meso sectors or on sectors, right? And is there any impact on individuals? So how do we study these various impacts that might happen? And in some cases, it might not be possible to put them all in a complete system and work them out, because the logic that works for a macro might be different from the logic that works for meso or for micro, and vice versa. So here I just adopt to a more straightforward way of saying that what are the likely possible consequences on other sectors. But essentially, the key point that I want to communicate is this focus on the meso approach, the macroeconomy to be understood also as a system of interrelated sectors.
Right. So Alex, actually, I should thank you for introducing us to the word meso approach, because so most of us in working on Indian economy or something, we tend to work that, but then when you have to situate it, you're not very sure whether it's macro, whether it's micro. It has elements of both. So I found that concept itself very interesting while reading the book. And just to move on to the next question. So we have been always taught only about this mainstream notions of equilibrium or mainstream concepts of economics, be it micro, be it macro, be it development economics. Everything revolves mostly around that. And with regard to this, we have a question from Manhar Manchanda, who is also a doctoral student at IIM Calcutta. So he asked that, besides introducing history of economic thought as a separate course in economics curriculum, how important is it for economics pedagogy to incorporate alternative approaches to mainstream theories? For instance, Marxian and Straffian linear production theories in light of the more general convex environment of the Walrasian general equilibrium model, serving as an all-encompassing model. So how can it be achieved in the pedagogy of especially at the formative stage of learning economics?
Yeah. So first, let me just take up the question of having history of economic thought as a separate course in the curriculum. Now, many colleges in India have history of economic thought in the curriculum, but the issue there is it's often taught in a linear fashion. So what it means is that Adam Smith said something, Ricardo said it better, Marx said it even better. Then you go on, and what you learn today is better than everyone sometimes. So that kind of a linear, narrative is problematic. So that kind of a cumulative way of how knowledge proceeds, because that's not the way knowledge proceeds. In some ways, Ricardo would have said it better than Smith. In some ways, Marx would have said it better. Keynes would have said it better. So there are all ways in which uh, it's not cumulative, it's non-linear in that way. And my own personal preference is to teach it as schools of thought which are contending in nature, because I mean there are fundamental differences between them, and they are both trying to explain the same thing, but they have different conceptual categories. For instance, one starts from methodological individualism, another from methodological holism, and there are different implications for that on policy. But that is one, I mean, so that's on my own preference of how HET should be taught. The other thing, and I feel this is more useful in a pedagogic way, is to have a history of economic thought perspective in all the courses, scattered. So suppose we have, I'm teaching microeconomics, I can devote 10% of that course to say that the history of, first of all, what I'm teaching you is only one kind of microeconomics, which comes from the tradition of Marshall, JB Say, Jevons, Walras. And even within here, there are differences between Walrasian, differences with Marshallian. Right? And also to say that, why do we start using these mathematics? What is the history of the use of mathematics in microeconomics? Why do we use calculus? Why don't we use some other method from maths or approach from maths? Or, for instance, what is the connection with physics? As I mentioned before, some kind of philosophy of science, or philosophy of physics, or philosophy of economics in a way. Or, for instance, if I'm teaching, more policy evaluation course, what is the history of RCT or the history of game theory? Now, game theory, I mean, initially was used in the context of war, right? So, and from there it has moved on. So, where have these methods developed? Are there ethical consequences? So, the history of ideas, in a way, can be easily brought in, and they only add to the richness of it. Uh, so I think that should not. I mean, I feel that if it's like saying that if we think that we want students to have actual experience going to the market and getting a feel for it, it's similar. It's a kind of intellectual history, uh, kind of a feel for intellectual history, or a kind of orientation to intellectual history that we want students to have. Now, the second part of the question, where you mention Marxian and Staffian as linear cases, and Walrasian as a convex kind of case. And the implication that you make here is somehow linear functions are a special case of the more general convex function. Now, this in itself is an assertion which needs to be thought through carefully, because the assumption of convexity is not it's a very strong assumption to make. It has consequences, and the question to ask is the assumption of convexity made, actually I'm working on this at the moment, but is the assumption of convexity made to ensure that you have an equilibrium? Is it a mathematical necessity, or is it a fact of economic life? So that's one part of the story. And what we consider general and what we consider specific depends on the standpoint. To me, uh, a linear production function, or the Marxian or the Staffian kind of way, is approaches reality more than a Walrasian kind of approach. So it also depends on the kind of standpoint. And in this context, it's important to recognize that there are mathematical possibilities. Mathematically, a function could be more general, but that does not translate into that being more general in the economic case. So how we move from pure theory or pure mathematics to applied mathematics, one has to be really cautious. And this is where I think we need to have a deeper understanding of the nature of economics itself, or the philosophy of economics, or the philosophy of mathematics itself. What does it really mean to translate notions from pure mathematics to applied mathematics? And one final point, which is that if we take textbooks, the way in which mainstream economics has tried to deal with challenges posed to it is by putting them as special cases or putting them at the end as paradoxes or some way like that. So, students are still, okay, we understand conspicuous consumption, we understand, some of these curious cases or the Leontief production function, but they are always seen as in a way subservient or not very important and not integral to your core apparatus. So this is also a strategy in which these challenges have been incorporated or just kept to the side really.
Alex, since you're talking about mathematics, there is one question that I've always had in my mind. And even in when Keen says who an economist should be, his statement begins with being a mathematician. And one of the striking features in your book is that there is hardly any depiction of this macroeconomic variables or the general equations that we keep seeing using mathematical functions, unless it's absolutely necessary. I think I found them in one or two chapters of growth. There are hardly like one or two equations. So has this been a conscious decision? And also, do you think the study of mathematics is inevitable for a student now to excel in economics in these times? Can we do without mathematics?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, so maybe once the recorded session is over, we can talk a little bit more about the mathematics in a more freer way. But my own position has been, and as I've documented in the book, is actually is in chapter 6 when I talk about economic theory. And I use very simple mathematics, algebra, to talk about the role of discipline. In a way, what formalizing helps us is to see through some of the things in a much more clear and concise fashion and understand some of the restrictions on the model, the interdependence, the implications. So what if we have made this theory, but for this theory to work, some prices have to be negative, for instance. Now, if we are to get a restriction like that, it's meaningless, which means that there is something amiss or something wrong here. But more generally speaking, mathematics is a language, and within mathematics, there are so many dialects. Now, are we training students to decide which dialect within mathematics they can choose? And how do we make that judgment? Right? So there's not just calculus, there are many other kinds of things, other kinds of areas in mathematics. And how are we making this question? And which to use, how to decide? And again, this goes back to the previous point I made, that when we move from pure math to applied math, there are many, many stages that we are crossing. And how cautious are we when we apply these highly abstract mathematics to understand actual socioeconomic situations? Then the question is, can we communicate ideas using mathematics? I think that yes. And I didn't want to do that because I think that, first of all, I'm not an expert in using it, and people who have used it well. So in that sense, I didn't want to repeat what others have done. But uh, if the book is also written for people who might be scared of mathematics, but who are still interested in economics questions around them. And it is possible to do economics and to do good economics, I think, without sophisticated mathematics also. Uh, and here I would just maybe tell one point, which is that just like when it comes to clothing or when it comes to pop culture, there are fashions. There are fashions in academia also. There are fashions in knowledge production. At some points in time in the past, if you've looked at it, game theory has been very popular with everyone wanting to do game theory. Before that, people wanted to do general equilibrium theory. Recently, people want to do RCT. Now, people want to do microeconometrics. Uh, so these things keep changing. Whatever is fashionable keeps changing depending on many factors in the field. And a striking piece of history is when Walras wrote his work, which is in mathematical economics largely in the 1870s. He failed to find a job in France. And the reason for that was mathematical economics was looked down upon. So this is just to say that, you should go with what you think helps understand, explain, and communicate the issues that you are studying well. It could be with maths, it could be without maths, but it's important to recognize that what the histories of the concepts that you're using are, and what the implications of that might be. Some of those implications might be known within the small domain that we work in. Some of these implications might be raised by people who are working outside our domain.
Alex, so while we're at the topic of communication of ideas and the importance of language, especially from moving from theory to practice, I think context also matters. Context or the examples which we use to communicate with the students, because the basic books that we have read a few years ago or even now are mostly rooted in the American context, because most textbooks have been American textbooks. So one very interesting thing about your book is that it's rooted in the examples from the Indian context. And I think it's actually a gift for the economic students who got tired of the examples of American textbooks. And so in that context, especially when we are talking about some national income concepts, or so how important is it to have this analysis of the national income or something based on one's domicile country? And also it is unlikely that an Indian student benefits much in understanding the computation of NI in the US and UK. So that's one thing. And the other part of the question is, we hardly discuss about Indian economic thought versus the evolution of Indian, which you have actually covered in your book. You talk about Mahalanobis and you talk about all those Indian thinkers. And but I don't think when you're talking about political economy, Arthashastra is, for example, discussed very much. So what do you think about the importance of the context in discussing these kinds of concepts?
So I think that firstly, studying national income accounting from the US context and the Indian context, I think that there are similarities because of the system of national income accounts, which is an international kind of agreement, and we are all trying to have some standardization across countries. But I would not begin a macroeconomics course with national income accounting. I would begin with trying to motivate what is it that we are trying to study. If we are trying to study the macroeconomy, what does it even mean? First of all, there is nothing like the macroeconomy. It's an abstraction that we have created so as to understand and to have something to say about how people in it are doing economically. So once we identify what is it that we are trying to study, then the question of measurement comes. And how do we measure well-being or economic well-being? And that's the fundamental question. Now, then I would introduce national income accounts as one of the ways of measuring economic well-being. And it's important to mention one of the ways of measuring economic well-being. And here, for instance, if you look at the history of national income accounting itself, when in the US, when it was initially introduced, there was a debate about whether to include government expenditure in GDP or not. And the reason for this was, if you include government expenditure, if you have wars, your GDP is going to shoot up. Right? So what is the implication of including versus excluding the role of wars in GDP? Let's say that the government decides to hike salaries to all government employees. What are the implications of that on GDP? Or if there is significant ecological destruction, what is the implication of that on GDP? Right? And let's say there's a lot of black income production. What is the implication of that on GDP? Now, what I want to say with all this is national income accounting, or any kind of accounting for that matter, is a deeply political endeavor. there is nothing apolitical about it. It's fundamentally and always, and it continues to be, a deeply political exercise, because after all, what is accounting? It is telling us what to measure, and therefore it is telling us what not to measure. So what is important and what is not important, right? So there is the politics of inclusion and exclusion there. So in that sense, accounting is the way it is taught is usually as a very mechanical way. But for instance, the question, and this I mentioned in my book as well, about women's work, household work, or environmental issues. And these have been raised in the past too. This is not a recent development. But why is it not being included? What is the resistance? So, in that sense, national income accounting itself, and any kind of accounting for that matter, is deeply political. Right? And maybe I'll just mention one more point in relation to this is, where does CSO get its data from? Is it primary data? Is it secondary data? Now, is it getting it from the agricultural department in Calcutta? If so, what is the quality of that? How are they collecting it? Who are the people who are actually gathering this data? If there are many varieties of rice, which variety of rice gets prioritized? So the entire process of accounting, starting from actually observing the data to the final thing, are beset with choices of what to include, what to exclude, right? In that sense, and it depends on how these things are carried out. So I feel that it is absolutely important to have accounting and various kinds of accounting, but it has to be understood in a much more richer fashion. It cannot be a simple mechanical exercise. So then the second question is, we spend more time talking about Keynes and Marx and not so much Indian economic thought. I have engaged in my book. I've actually engaged with Rana De, Ambedkar. There are many others. K. N. Raj I've mentioned. Of course, Krishna Bharadwaj. So there are many people I've engaged with. But to the specific question of, let's say, Arthashastra is also mentioned. But when I talk about political economy, I don't mention them because it depends on what my focus is. And my focus here has been the theory of output, or a theory of monetary production economy, the theory of growth in a monetary production economy. And in Arthashastra, you don't find any theory of macroeconomy as such. Right? But in Arthashastra, you will find concerns about what price to give. And so there's not a theory, but there is an account of it, and you can make some, you can draw some implications from it. And in fact, I'm now actually working on a history of economic thought textbook, but I have a section, or I have a chapter on Arthashastra there. So where I hope to bring out some of the issues, but also point out why there's no theory there as such.
So one last question from my end before we open up the floor for discussion. And as we move to the topic of theory, so there is something that really caught my eye in the book, and especially in the chapter Why Economic Theory Matters. You talk about the caveats in big data driving policy choices as opposed to the theory driving the choices. And you argue, and I quote, "We must not sacrifice the conceptual clarity provided by economic theory at the altar of big data." Why do you think so?
Yeah, so I think this is, of course, this is a response to a kind of empiricism that is sometimes visible, which, there was a point in time when people said that they're atheoretical, or their models are atheoretical, or their empirical work is atheoretical in some ways. And I think that what theory is trying to give us is a kind of a conceptual clarity, or a kind of discipline to make sense of certain phenomena and how they are interconnected. Now, if you do away with that, and I don't know if people are actually doing away with it, or they're just being eclectic about their influences, what it means is that you can say whatever you want to say, one, and we're not sure of how to put them together. But that is one side of the story. The other side is there is a constant tendency to find technological solutions to human problems, which are essentially social and political, and where people need to come together to have some kind of a solution. Right? So a bit cautious of that kind of technological solutions, and big data is an expression of a particular kind of a technological solution to public issues or public problems. But of course, they can be one of the inputs into any kind of decision making. Right? So all I'm saying is that we cannot throw away, or we cannot discard the kind of discipline and the kind of clarity that theory provides. And to say that, we don't need it because everything can be found in data, because as I said before, accounting is deeply political. Any kind of data collection is also deeply political. For instance, the quality of data, who collects it? Right? So, and let me just respond or to this question, or end by saying just two things. When we do programming, or when we put in something even simple as Excel, and I wanted to give me a visual, a chart, or why does it choose the particular kind of class intervals it does? Why does it choose a particular way in which it presents the data? So the algorithm has a particular theory, or to call it that, of its logic of its own, and then I am a user using it, and it's being mediated by all these programs. But when the data becomes huge and the statistical operations become large, there are so many choices that are being made by the algorithm, which we know of or we don't know of. Right? So I'm just saying that we need to be, and here one needs to know more of the statistical theory itself. So one is the economic theory, but also the statistical theory which is underlying all this. And finally, let me just end by saying that so for the last 3 years I've been teaching a basic statistics course to humanities students, and so it's a more hands-on course. And it is in that, when I was preparing for that course, I came across this concept which we were coming to in different ways, but it was called data feminism. What and this is what I really mean, that data is fundamentally political, and it depends on how data is being collected, being used, and the questions of power cannot be separated from the questions of data. So just by saying, okay, here is the data, this is what it shows, cannot be taken just because there are numbers in front of us. So I think that there needs to be a better critical engagement, and when we bring in big data, it just means that there are so many more levels that we have to engage with, rather than writing a simple mathematical model, because there is only so little information that you have to critically engage with. So that is why I write in the book, and I quote Siddhartha Mukherjee, medical doctor, where the biases actually increase when we bring in big data.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. It's been wonderful. All the questions, thank you for patiently answering. And now the floor is open for the audience to take part in the discussion. You can show a raise of hand and ask the question by yourself, or unmute your microphone, or you can even post it in the chat box and we can take it from there. Yeah, Shailendra, please go ahead.
Hey, hi, Alex. Thank you for this talk. I am an illiterate in economics, so pardon the poor framing of the question. Okay, I'm a student of strategic management. Am I audible, Kranti? Enough?
Yes, Shailendra.
Good enough.
Yeah.
So I'm a student of strategic management. So the question is related to that. You talked about meso-layer, the sectors, the industry, and the different markets between micro and macro. Now, the primary unit of analysis in strategic management is firm. Okay, so the question is related to firm. Now, the strategic management as a separate field started in around mid-80s and was seeded by actual economists. Okay, and the first intellectual resource was the theory of firm, which basically says that firm is a consequence of market failure. Okay. And from there it started, and since then it has drifted a lot. So coming to that later, but the question is that what strategic management as a field found limiting or reductionist in economics is twofold. One is the concept of rationality itself, which you also alluded to. So as a purely ahistorical rationality, okay, maximizing kind of thinking, that was questionable, empirically what we observe for farm behavior, that was not fitting in. So that is one, the concept of rationality itself. The second reductionist thing that we found as a field was the concept of decision maker. So firm as a decision maker, uh, when we talked about game theory, we are basically anthropomorphizing the firm as a person. Okay, so that we also, so game theory had a good amount of traction in early strategic management, no longer now because of that limitation. So so the first part of the question is that why economics, micro or macro, has ignored firm as a unit of analysis, whereas it covers industries or sectors or markets. Is it because it doesn't find any qualitative difference in terms of the study of firm or study of industry, or it thinks it's insignificant decision-making unit, or it thinks that the existing theories will explain the firm behavior also? That is the first part of the question, that why there is a lack of interest on firm as a unit of analysis. Of course, if economics chooses to do so, we will be destroyed. That's another thing. The second part, supplementary to that, is that now what I'm hearing from you is that uh, this embeddedness thing is again talked about, that we should not think of economic decisions as a disembedded decisions. And that's the departure that we had. We in strategic management think that all firm decisions are embedded decisions, okay, and not necessarily an outcome of a cold-blooded rationality. Okay, so now that economics is also moving towards that direction, do you see in future that interest in firms coming up?
Kranti, shall I respond to that? Yeah. So no, it's interesting that you should mention, the theory of the firm and Ronald Coase and all that. And I think again, this is coming out of the same methodological individualism, the science of choice kind of idea there. And it's true that apart from the rationality, what is the way in which these economists characterize competition is the most static way. Because for in supposedly perfect competition, which is the ideal state, firms are supposed to be price takers. Now, fundamentally, that goes against any kind of dynamic notion of competition, where firms are trying to make different kinds of changes, whether to inventory decisions, whether to price decisions, whether to quantity decisions, whether to advertisements, and to then assume that a firm is a price taker is just fundamentally anti-dynamic, or I would say anti-competitive. And so that's the context in which they are setting it up. But within the alternate tradition, there are people like, I'll just mention a few names and put them in chat as well. There has been an interest in firm theory from the non-mainstream schools, and some of the people who have worked on it, Thorstein Veblen, who worked on business enterprises, who's also known as an institutional economist. Another institutional economist was Kenneth Galbraith. He has also worked on firm and how business enterprises function. And two other people who have worked on the question of firm, one is Edith Penrose and the other is Robin Maris. So both of them were at Cambridge. They come within the Cambridge UK tradition. So all of them have looked at firm as a much more strategic, having a much more active role to play. And there's somebody else also by the name Paulo Silos Labini, who's coming from a classical political economy tradition, who is also engaged with questions of the firm. So it's just that I think the strategic management literature, when even its history is only connected to marginalist, the signs of choice kind of literature. But in the alternative traditions, there have been a lot of literature on the firm. I mean, lot when I say is relative material on this.
Thank you,
Alex. That was useful.
We have question
Thank
from
you,
Himadri.
yeah.
Himadri, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Alex, for this wonderful talk. Sorry for asking a slightly commercially inclined question. So my question is, how do you assess the role of job markets, which kinds of forces people to study economics from a more model-driven culture than a culture-driven model that you talked about? And do we have enough institutes and journals to actually accept macroeconomics in this revised framework?
Yeah, so, well, the answer, I think you know the answer to the question, which is, I mean, it's difficult to say, right? So it's a bit like, we don't know. But so which is why I feel in a way, the odds are tipped against, well, me or you, depending on how you think about it. Because if it also depends on, okay, let me try to answer it in a different way. Now, who is it that we want to communicate with? Right? Who's our audience? Am I trying to communicate with my students? Am I trying to communicate with my colleagues who think in a similar way, who might be sitting in the US or Italy or Australia or Japan? Or am I trying to communicate with academics who are, let's say, in the top, in quotes, universities in the US or elsewhere? So I think that really matters, because it's a kind of signaling. It's also, after all, whether when we talk about peer review, there are rankings in place, but these rankings are always dependent on who are in power. If it's mathematical economists, if it's econometricians, or whoever it might be, at a point in time, political economy papers were published in political economy, meaning classical political economy, history of economic thought papers were published in Econometrica. They were published in Journal of Political Economy. So, it depends on the politics of knowledge production and who is in power. And we can communicate, important aspects of economics to students here, or we can try to, publish it in a journal and communicate it, indirectly. So I really think the question, I mean, I don't think, of course, we all need to find jobs and we have to do what is expected as well. But in the Indian context, I feel that we are still not Americanized so much that we have to publish, at least not all places. Some of them are. So I think that it really depends on what is it that we are trying to do and who is it that we want to communicate with. So that's the way I would respond to the question without, giving some sort of a yes or no answer to that.
Does anybody else have any question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm AJC Bose from Delhi University, SRCC. I've checked in on my wife's name.
Okay.
I'm very happy to be with you, Kranti and Alex. And thanks to Banikanta, Professor. My question is very pragmatic. It has already been stated very well in that AP Tharwal series, Great Thinkers in Economics, the one dedicated to Joan Robinson, that her heterodox textbook, jointly written with John E. Twell, was a failure, flop. So since you are talking about pedagogical transformation, my question to Alex is that, well, you are definitely on the right track. Now, how do you now change the kind of such a solidly entrenched conservatism in pedagogy, say in the Delhi University, we have terrible time to even make a marginal change. Same Dornbusch Fisher and all, and then test banks and all this textbook industry of Mankiw, Colander. You have a study guide for student, you have test banks. So what is the how you teach, and how you evaluate the student in this transformation that you are seeking? For example, I've informed all my DU students, not a single one has come to today's meeting. Okay, so which means that they just want all the question banks. Right now their exams are cancelled, they're thrilled. Otherwise they will do past questions, how do you find the solutions. This is the orientation of the student. The student is not at all interested in whether the ideas are properly posed or not. Thank you.
Okay, so of course, this is, I don't have a answer to this naturally. But I think, I think in public universities versus private universities, there's a difference. And I feel, I don't know, when I was a student at the University of Hyderabad as well, I remember that if we didn't study, or if we failed the exam, we failed the exam. But I know from colleagues now that students will say that, no, or there is a certain kind of demand that comes from students as well, where people are okay if not so much content is covered. People are okay if the answers are already given in advance. And again, this is not, I don't think the blame can be put on the students or the teachers, but I think it's the we have to rethink education completely. It's the nature of us looking at marks or looking at ranks, and we are not really thinking of education as a more transformative experience. So it's, well, what can I do about it? So my own approach, this is another reason for actually when I thought of how to write the book, I thought that I want to write it addressed to the students. I am not writing for my colleagues. I'm not writing for other people. The reader of this book has to be a student who can actually feel, what I'm trying to say here. And that way, my attempts have been really at trying to get the book in the hands of students who care. And I think that it might take time, but yeah, part of the story is trying to get the book into the hands of the students who might have different views. But for my own approach in my class is, if they don't, if they're not engaged in the way that I want them to be, they get low marks or they fail the exam. But again, because of this, when at least in a more privatization kind of framework, it means that if we are paying so much money, how can I fail? So it's all interrelated, and I think that it's very difficult to figure out how to do things. But like my response, I think, to the previous question, I think that all of us are trying what we can do to our best, and hope that something will happen.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think what Professor Bose is telling is also a big issue that we see in state universities or other kinds of university, where the autonomy is relatively less for the faculty in terms of the syllabus, which I think in a place like Central University or maybe even private university, the teacher has more flexibility to play around with that. But I think when, that is one thought which struck me while I was reading your book. I think that kind of textbooks that we are given, so if we have more access to such textbooks, I think even at the university level, say Delhi University, or let's say some Andhra University or Nagarjuna University, whatever, wherever. So I think overall, when the textbooks change, the nature of textbooks change in the standardized manner itself, I think the ideas can be propagated more at the higher level. That's all I could think of. Yeah. So thanks for that question. And any more questions? I think we can spend 5 more minutes and then we can close the session. If anybody has any further questions.
Yes, there's a comment, that sensitizing B schools about sustainability and environment has taken ages. Yeah, and I think that this is a slow process, and with a group of people who come together, and I think the way in which, I mean, this is what I find very surprising in a way, that the teacher who has to teach the course does not decide what goes into the course. Right? So the autonomy is like taken off from different parts. And sometimes I've seen syllabuses where there are like 15 books which are there, I mean, which neither the student can read nor the teacher can read, but it's just there in the syllabus. So who's making the syllabus, who's teaching it, then the disconnect between where the student is coming from, where the person who sets the syllabus is coming from. So I think, yeah, and of course the reliance on exam of a particular kind, I feel. Yeah, but I feel that with more critical mass, we yeah, hope.
Yeah. Any more questions? So I guess that's it for today. Thank you very much, Alex. It has been very interesting to discuss with you. You have taught us when we were integrated students, like undergrad level. You came for 2 guest lectures and taught us chemistry, and that was the first interaction with you. And ever since, getting to know you or hearing your thoughts through your blog or otherwise, and now through your journals and journal articles and books, I think it's been fascinating. And we certainly need more thinkers like you, and I'm sure you're going to inspire all of us furthermore in this discipline of economics. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kranti. And I also see many of my friends and from Hyderabad University and from others. And thank you so much, Professor Bose and Bani, for coming and being here. I think it's always also a good feeling, because now I can't see anyone. There are only some faces, but it's good to see familiar names and familiar faces. And yeah, thank you for being here and listening.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll be ending the session now.